It is 1975, a hardware store in suburban Ohio. The shelves where the garden chemicals used to sit are completely bare. A handwritten sign reads, "Product discontinued, EPA order." And then the Environmental Protection Agency, created just 5 years earlier in 1970, cancelled the second wave of home garden chemicals in a single regulatory sweep, and 25 tricks that had fed American families through the Depression and World War II victory gardens simply vanished from legal use overnight. Gardeners who had relied on these methods for 30 years stood in those aisles confused, angry, and empty-handed. Some of these tricks cost almost nothing. Some required no equipment at all. They worked. That was never really the question. The question was what they were quietly doing to the soil, the water table, and the people eating the food. 25 methods, regulated, restricted, or flat-out banned across the United States after 1975. Every single one of them has a story worth knowing. The white powder. Nobody questioned. Walk into any hardware store in America before 1972 and you would find it right there on the shelf, next to the seed packets and the trowels. DDT dust, sold in small cardboard canisters with cheerful green lettering and a drawing of a beetle crossed out in red. Cheap enough that a Depression-era family could afford it without thinking twice. For roughly 30 years, home gardeners across the United States dusted it directly onto tomatoes, beans, squash, and cabbage. The routine was simple and almost ritual. You opened the canister, you squeezed the bellows, and a fine white cloud settled over the leaves like frost. The powder clung to every surface, the underside of leaves, the stems, the soil crust around the base of each plant. It killed beetles, aphids, and caterpillars on contact. Within hours, the insects were gone. The plants looked clean and healthy. Neighbors compared notes over backyard fences. Hardware store owners reordered by the case. It was considered a miracle. Nobody asked what happened after the insects died. The answer, it turned out, was that nothing happened. That was the problem. DDT does not break down. It binds to soil particles and stays there, not for a season, not for a decade, but for generations. Scientists studying fields dusted in the 1950s were still finding measurable DDT residue in the 1990s. It moves up the food chain in a process called bioaccumulation. A beetle absorbs a small dose. A robin eats 100 beetles. A hawk eats a dozen robins. At each step, the concentration multiplies. It does not dilute. It does not leave. It compounds silently through every link in the chain until the concentrations become toxic at the top. William Ruckelshaus, the first administrator of the newly formed EPA, cancelled all crop uses of DDT on June 14, 1972. It was the agency's first major act. The decision was not popular. Chemical companies fought it hard in the press and in the courts. Farmers protested at state capitals. But the science was unambiguous. Rachel Carson had laid it out in Silent Spring a full decade earlier, in 1962, and the data had only grown more damning since. Thinning eggshells, collapsing raptor populations, peregrine falcons disappearing from cliff faces where they had nested for centuries, breast milk samples from women who had never set foot on a farm testing positive for organochlorine residues. The evidence was everywhere once researchers knew what to look for. The birds were the most visible sign, but the contamination was moving through every layer of the food web simultaneously. For home gardeners, the ban landed differently than it did for commercial farms. There was no transition program, no replacement product waiting on the shelf. The canister you had used on your tomatoes last summer was now illegal. The soil in your raised bed, if you had been dusting it since the 1950s, was already carrying a chemical load that would outlast your grandchildren. Researchers who tested residential garden soils in the late 1970s found DDT concentrations in some suburban plots that exceeded the levels found in commercial agricultural fields. The home gardener, who had used the product more casually and more frequently than most farmers, had sometimes accumulated more contamination per square foot than the operations the regulation was primarily aimed at. DDT is completely banned today for any garden use in the United States. No exceptions. No permits. Gone. The trench that fed the garden. The Greywater Trench's quiet reputation would later become the exact thing that triggered a nationwide regulatory overhaul of residential water practices. But in 1965, it was just a sensible way to keep a garden alive through a dry summer. Picture a backyard in rural Georgia, late August, 1967. The well is low. The municipal water bill has doubled. A woman named Edna Pruitt, 61 years old, does what her mother taught her and her grandmother taught her mother. She pulls the drain hose from the back of the washing machine, runs it through a gap in the screen door, and lets the rinse water flow into a shallow trench she has dug along the base of her tomato row. The trench is maybe 4 inches deep, cut with a garden hoe in the red clay soil, angled just enough to let the water spread slowly, rather than pool. She has done this so many times that the hoe handle has worn smooth in the same 2 spots where her palms grip it. The water is warm and faintly sudsy. It carries trace amounts of phosphate from the detergent. The tomatoes do not care. They drink it up. The soil stays moist for 2 days without a drop of rain. The plants look better than the neighbors' plants, which are wilting by noon. Edna is not doing anything unusual. Across the American South, the rural Midwest, and the drought-prone Southwest, this practice is standard. Dishwater, laundry rinse water, water from rinsing vegetables, all of it goes into the garden. It conserves water. It delivers trace nutrients. It costs nothing. In the 1940s and 1950s, during wartime rationing and post-depression frugality, it was not just common, it was encouraged. Extension Service pamphlets from the USDA reference the practice without a single word of caution. That was only round 1. By the late 1960s, something was shifting. Municipal water treatment engineers in California and Arizona were beginning to notice a pattern. Residential neighborhoods with high rates of informal grey water discharge, laundry water, sink water, bath water routed directly to yards and gardens were showing elevated bacterial counts in shallow groundwater monitoring wells. Not catastrophic numbers, not the kind of numbers that made headlines, but consistent, reproducible, trending upward year after year in the same neighborhoods, in the same monitoring zones, season after season. The engineers kept their notes. They compared data across districts. The pattern held. The issue was not the water itself, exactly. The issue was what was in it. Modern laundry detergents introduced in the post-war boom years contained surfactants, optical brighteners, and in some formulations, trace amounts of boron and sodium compounds that accumulated in soil over time. Dishwater carried grease, food particles, and bacteria from raw meat. Bathwater carried human pathogens. None of this had mattered much when the practice was occasional and the volumes were small. But by the 1960s, American households were doing 4, 5, 6 loads of laundry a week. The volumes were no longer small. The soil beneath suburban yards was absorbing a slow, invisible chemical inventory that nobody had authorized and nobody was tracking. The regulatory response did not come all at once. It came in layers, state by state, through the 1970s and into the 1980s. California moved first, classifying untreated grey water as a regulated waste stream under its Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act. Arizona followed, then Texas, then a cascade of states across the South and Midwest that had the highest rates of informal grey water use, and not coincidentally, the most documented cases of shallow groundwater contamination linked to residential discharge. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. By the late 1980s, more than 15 states had enacted statutes either requiring permits for any direct grey water to soil discharge or prohibiting it outright. The permit requirements were not symbolic. In California, a residential grey water system that routes laundry water to a subsurface irrigation setup requires a plumbing permit, an inspection, and compliance with Title 22 of the California Code of Regulations. The system must include a surge tank, a valve, and a mechanism to divert flow to the sewer during periods of soil saturation. The cost of a compliant system in 2024 runs between $800 and $3,000 depending on the county. Arizona allows grey water reuse under what it calls the Type 1 General Permit, but only for single-family residences, only for subsurface drip irrigation, and only if the system meets a specific list of construction standards. Direct surface application to a vegetable garden, the exact method Edna Pruitt used in 1967, is prohibited. The water cannot pool, it cannot run off, it cannot contact the edible portion of any plant. In states like Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, the rules are stricter still. Direct discharge of any grey water to soil without a permit is classified as an illegal discharge under state environmental codes. Violations carry fines. Repeat violations can trigger referral to the State Environmental Enforcement Division. The gardeners who grew up watching their parents run the washwater to the tomatoes did not see this coming. The practice felt harmless. It looked harmless. For decades, it was treated as harmless. And then the groundwater data started accumulating, the regulatory framework started tightening, and a method that had sustained kitchen gardens through 2 world wars became, in most of the country, a permit violation. Edna Pruitt celebrated when her tomatoes came in that August. She stood at the end of her row in the late afternoon heat, her hands still damp from the hoe, looking at fruit so heavy the cages were leaning. She had no idea she was standing at the end of something. She shouldn't have celebrated quite so soon. But this wasn't just about greywater anymore. Every trick on this list followed the same arc, trusted for decades, quietly studied, and then regulated out of existence before most gardeners even knew the conversation was happening. The reckoning. It is 1946, a Victory Garden plot in suburban Cincinnati. The war is over, the soldiers are coming home, and every square foot of backyard soil is still expected to produce. The stakes are not abstract. Families are still stretching every resource they have. Seed catalogs are dog-eared. Compost bins are full. And the soil amendment that costs nothing, that has always cost nothing, is still moving from the sewage treatment plant on the west side of the city directly into the hands of home gardeners. The Municipal Sewage Authority is doing what municipal sewage authorities across America have done for generations. They are processing human waste. They are drying it. They are bagging it. And they are selling it to gardeners at a discount, sometimes giving it away entirely because the alternative is paying to haul it somewhere else. Night soil has a long history in this country, longer than most people realize. Colonial farmers knew it. 19th century market gardeners knew it. The Victory Garden movement knew it too, and the guides published by the USDA and various state extension offices said so plainly. Human waste, properly composted, is one of the most nitrogen-dense, phosphorus-rich soil amendments a gardener can access. The science was not wrong. The science was incomplete. And then the post-war chemical boom happened, and for a decade or two, everyone forgot about the old ways. Synthetic fertilizer was cheap. It was clean. It came in a bag with a logo on it. But by the late 1960s, with chemical inputs under scrutiny and the Back to the Land movement gathering momentum, gardeners started reaching back. They started pulling out the old Victory Garden manuals. They started asking their local water treatment facilities what happened to the processed sludge. And in many cases, the answer was, you can have it. And then the municipalities made the one decision that changed everything. They scaled up. They started distributing processed sewage sludge, not just to curious homesteaders, but to commercial farms, municipal parks, school gardens, and suburban gardeners by the truckload. The product had a new name by then, biosolids. It sounded clean. It sounded scientific. It sounded like something you would want near your tomatoes. The bags were labeled with green leaf logos. The marketing language talked about returning nutrients to the earth. It was, in the vocabulary of the early 1970s, sustainable. What the distribution programs did not fully account for was what else was in the sludge. This is where the story turns, because sewage sludge is not just human waste. It is everything that goes down every drain in a modern city. Industrial effluent, hospital waste, pharmaceutical compounds, heavy metals from manufacturing runoff, cadmium, lead, mercury, arsenic. These elements do not break down in composting. They do not evaporate. They accumulate. They bind to soil particles. They get taken up by plant roots. They move up the food chain, one vegetable at a time. A tomato grown in cadmium-laden soil does not look different from a tomato grown in clean soil. It tastes the same. It weighs the same. The contamination is invisible at every step until it is not. In the decades that followed, researchers would understand exactly what this meant. But in the early 1970s, the data was still being gathered, and the gardeners spreading municipal sludge on their food beds had no idea what was accumulating in their soil. They were following instructions from guides published by the federal government. They were doing what their grandparents had done. They believed they were doing something responsible, and somehow it gets worse. Because the contamination was not uniform and it was not visible. A gardener in Portland might be spreading relatively clean processed sludge from a facility with tight industrial discharge controls. A gardener in Gary, Indiana, might be spreading sludge loaded with cadmium from steel mill runoff. There was no labeling requirement. There was no testing standard. There was no way for a home gardener to know the difference, and most of them never thought to ask. They were following instructions from guides published by the federal government. They were doing what their grandparents had done. They believed they were doing something responsible, something sustainable, something that closed the loop between human consumption and soil fertility. The pathogens were the other half of the problem: Salmonella, E. coli, hepatitis A, Cryptosporidium. These organisms survive composting if the temperature and duration of the composting process are not precisely controlled. Industrial facilities were inconsistent. Home composting of human waste was worse, and the vegetable patch was where all of it ended up. The turning point arrives in 1993. The EPA publishes what becomes known as the Part 503 rule, the standards for the use or disposal of sewage sludge. It is a dense regulatory document. It runs to hundreds of pages. It sets concentration limits for 9 heavy metals. It establishes pathogen reduction requirements. It creates 2 categories of biosolids, Class A and Class B, with different application restrictions for each. And buried in the fine print of Part 503 is the effective end of the old DIY tradition. Raw sewage sludge on home food gardens is now prohibited. Full stop. The rule does not make the news the way a product recall would. There is no press conference. There is no public announcement delivered to the millions of gardeners who have been following the old practice for years. The regulation moves through the Federal Register and lands in the files of municipal water authorities and commercial agricultural operators, and the home gardener is largely left to figure it out on their own. What changed was the entire framework of how human waste relates to food production. For centuries, the relationship was direct and practical. Waste became fertility. Fertility became food. The cycle was visible and immediate. After 1993, that cycle was broken by law, replaced by a regulated industrial process that most home gardeners cannot access or afford. The commercially processed biosolids that are still sold today, products like Milorganite, are Class A certified, meaning they have met strict pathogen and metal reduction standards. They are not the same product that was being spread from municipal trucks in 1971. The old way is gone. The new way requires a certified industrial facility, an EPA compliance program, and a supply chain that a backyard gardener cannot replicate. The knowledge did not disappear. The practice did. And that gap between what gardeners used to know and what they are now legally permitted to do is exactly where the next trick lived. Up to this point, the old-time gardeners had been winning, coaxing extraordinary yields from the soil using methods that cost almost nothing and wasted almost nothing. That was about to flip. The fugitive. There is a barn in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The year is 1958. A farmer named Earl Stoltzfus has just finished mucking out his horse stalls, and he is doing exactly what his father taught him and his grandfather taught his father. He is loading that fresh manure directly onto his kitchen garden beds. He is digging it in with a fork, turning the dark steaming mass into the soil until it disappears beneath the surface. The smell is sharp, and animal, and familiar. The steam rises off the pile in the cold morning air. He works methodically, row by row, the fork handle slick with moisture, the soil opening dark and rich beneath each turn. He is planting his transplants the same afternoon. The beds will be extraordinary by July. They always are. The tomatoes will be heavy and sweet. The squash will sprawl past the fence line. The corn will be taller than his youngest son. Earl knows this because it has always been this way, because the barn and the garden have always been connected, because the cycle has always worked. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, not because Earl Stoltzfus did anything wrong by the standards of 1958. He did everything right. Fresh manure was the gold standard of soil amendment for most of American agricultural history. Horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure, pig manure, all of it went straight to the garden, often within hours of collection. The nitrogen content in fresh manure is at its highest before volatilization begins. The beneficial microbial activity is at its peak. Every experienced gardener and farmer knew this. The extension bulletins said it. The farming almanacs said it. The agricultural colleges taught it. Fresh manure dug directly into food beds was not a folk remedy. It was mainstream horticultural practice, endorsed by every credible source available to a working farmer in 1958. The problem was not the manure, the problem was what was living in it. E. coli 0157:H7 is a strain that was not even formally identified until 1982. Before that, it did not have a name, which meant that when people became seriously ill after eating contaminated produce, the investigation often went nowhere. The symptoms looked like ordinary food poisoning. The source was difficult to trace. The connection between fresh manure application and leafy green contamination was not well understood because nobody was looking for it systematically. The data that would eventually drive federal rulemaking did not exist yet. The outbreaks were happening. The cause was not yet visible. Families were getting sick and recovering and never knowing why, and the garden that fed them was never suspected. Now, Earl Stoltzfus could have stopped there. He didn't. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the food safety infrastructure in America is finally catching up to the problem. The Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak of 1993 kills 4 children and sickens more than 700 people. It is a watershed moment for food safety policy. The investigation focuses on ground beef, but the broader regulatory conversation it triggers reaches all the way to fresh produce and the soil it grows in. Epidemiologists start tracing contamination pathways more rigorously. They start asking not just what people ate, but how that food was grown, and the answers coming back from the field are alarming. In 1996, a multi-state outbreak of E. coli O157:H7 is linked to unpasteurized apple juice. In 2006, a massive spinach outbreak sickens 205 people across 26 states and kills 3. The investigation traces the contamination to a California field where cattle ranching and leafy green production share a watershed. Fresh animal waste, direct soil contact, a crop harvested and eaten raw. The connection is no longer theoretical. Read that again. 205 people, 26 states, 3 dead, from spinach, from a field that was being farmed the way fields had always been farmed, with animal waste moving freely through the landscape, with no mandated waiting period between contamination event and harvest, with no federal standard governing how close a manure application could be to a harvest date. The spinach looked clean. It was bagged and labeled and stacked in refrigerator cases in grocery stores across the country. And it was carrying a pathogen load that 3 people did not survive. The federal response builds slowly, but it builds with weight. The Food Safety Modernization Act is signed into law in January 2011. It is the most significant overhaul of American food safety law since 1938. The produce safety rules that flow from FSMA take years to finalize, but when they land hard. For commercial growers, the application of raw biological soil amendments of animal origin, the regulatory language for manure, is now governed by strict application intervals. Raw manure must be applied at least 120 days before harvest for crops where the edible portion contacts the soil, 90 days for crops where the edible portion does not contact the soil. These are not suggestions, these are federal food safety requirements, enforceable by the FDA. The old practice of digging fresh manure in the day before transplanting is now, for any commercial grower subject to FSMA, produce safety rules, a federal food safety violation. Earl Stoltzfus planting his tomatoes in horse manure on a Tuesday afternoon is not a romantic image of sustainable farming. Under current federal rules, it is a compliance failure. The consequences ripple through small farming operations across the country. A market gardener who has been running a 2-acre plot the same way for 30 years has to restructure her entire planting calendar. She has to either source aged or composted manure, which costs more and requires planning months in advance, or she has to apply raw manure in the fall and wait through the winter before planting spring crops. The spontaneity is gone. The flexibility is gone. The connection between the barn and the garden bed, which had been direct and immediate for centuries, now runs through a federal regulatory timeline measured in months rather than hours. She keeps a laminated copy of the FSMA application intervals tacked to the inside of her barn door. She checks it every spring before she touches a fork to the manure pile. She has been farming this land for 31 years. She knows every low spot where the water pools after rain, every corner where the soil runs thin over hard pan, every row where the yields have always been strongest. The barn smells exactly the way it always did. The garden beds are waiting exactly where they always were. The distance between them has not changed in feet, it has changed in law. Home gardeners are technically in a grayer space. FSMA produce safety rules apply primarily to commercial operations above certain sales thresholds. But the FDA has made clear that the underlying science applies to everyone, and many state and local health codes have adopted similar standards. The old-timer who still digs fresh chicken manure into his raised beds the morning of planting is not necessarily breaking a federal law. He is, however, doing something that federal food safety science has classified as a significant contamination risk. He is working outside the consensus. He is trusting a practice that the regulatory framework has formally reclassified as dangerous. The knowledge of how to do it is everywhere. It is in every old farming manual, every agricultural history, every oral tradition passed down through generations of rural families. The practice was not erased, it was reclassified. It moved from endorsed practice to prohibited risk, and the gardeners who still do it are now outliers, working outside the regulatory consensus rather than within it. What the FSMA era created was a permanent gap between the gardening past and the gardening present. A gap measured not in years but in pathogen loads, outbreak investigations, and the names of 3 people who died from spinach in 2006. The barn in Lancaster County is still there. The horse stalls still need mucking. The manure still steams on cold mornings. Earl Stoltzfus's granddaughter farms the same plot now. She uses a soil thermometer and a calendar. She orders certified compost from a supplier 2 counties over. She gets good yields. She does not get the yields her grandfather got, or at least she tells herself she doesn't, because the memory of what the garden used to be is part of the inheritance too. The garden beds are still waiting on the other side of the fence, but the path from the stall to the garden bed now runs through a calendar, a compliance checklist, and a federal statute that Earl Stoltzfus never heard of and never needed to. The distance between the barn and the garden has not changed in feet, it has changed in law. There is one more trick on this list that follows the same arc, trusted for generations, practiced without question, and then quietly reclassified as a sanitation violation before most people realized anyone was paying attention. Still practiced, still prohibited. Diluted urine feeds your garden for free. Kerosene kills grubs. It kills your groundwater too.